There comes a day when sympathy dies. It does not go quietly. It collapses under its own weight, like a fragile bridge that could no longer bear the burden of illusion. For the empath, this death feels like betrayal. Sympathy had always seemed holy proof of goodness, of humanity, of love. It had been the impulse that compelled them to reach into another's darkness, to soothe every wound, to pour themselves out without hesitation. It had been their compass, their calling, their pride. But sympathy was never what it appeared. Sympathy is pity dressed in virtue's clothing. It bends downward, gazing upon the other as fragile, broken, dependent. It creates a hierarchy, one strong, one weak, one healer, one helpless. It does not honor equality. It assumes imbalance, and in that imbalance, both are lost. The narcissist fed on it. They learned to perform weakness, to weaponize fragility, to collapse into need whenever accountability approached. They discovered that sympathy was the perfect shield, deflecting criticism, excusing cruelty, erasing responsibility. With every tear, every sigh, every story of betrayal, they secured another portion of the empath's life force. And the empath, believing sympathy was love, surrendered willingly. Carl Jung wrote that the unconscious rules us until it is made conscious. For years, the empath lived unconsciously in the grip of sympathy, mistaking their own wound for compassion. Each act of sacrifice was an attempt to redeem the child within the one who learned love was earned through service, silence, and erasure. But now the unconscious has surfaced. The illusion has shattered, and sympathy exposed for what it truly was: lies, lifeless. The funeral is not public. No mourners gather. It is a private death carried in the hollow ache of the empath's chest. They grieve quietly, realizing that what they thought was their greatest gift has also been their deepest betrayal. They grieve the years spent mistaking pity for devotion, sacrifice for purpose, captivity for love. This is not an easy death to accept. Sympathy had been an identity. Without it, who are they? If they are not the healer, the rescuer, the one who stays when others leave, then what remains? The silence after sympathy's death is terrifying. It feels like emptiness. But beneath that emptiness lies possibility. For in the death of sympathy, a new path begins. Not the path of blind giving, but of discernment. Not the path of pity, but of compassion. Not the path of erasure, but of presence. The empath does not yet know this. They only know loss. They feel stripped bare, their identity collapsing with the illusions they once cherished. They are left with questions too heavy to carry. What if my love was never love at all? What if my goodness was blindness? What if my sacrifice was only a way to avoid my own shadow? This is the funeral of sympathy, the end of illusion, the end of unconscious servitude, the end of the false belief that love means rescue, and rescue means worth. And though the coffin is closed, the soil heavy, and the grief overwhelming this funeral is not the end. It is the threshold. For only when sympathy dies can the real work begin. On the surface, sympathy looks like a gift. It appears generous, tender, selfless. It is the hand extended in another's darkness, the voice whispering, "I will not abandon you." The empath has long believed this gift to be their offering to the world, their proof of goodness, their contribution to love. But beneath the wrapping, sympathy is hollow. It does not nourish the one who gives, nor the one who receives. It is like pouring water into a sieve. No matter how much is given, nothing remains. The narcissist thrives on this hollow gift. They know its texture, its flavor, its power. They know that sympathy is not anchored in truth, but in illusion. It bypasses accountability, shields them from responsibility, and turns the empath's compassion into fuel for their ego. Carl Jung wrote that the persona, the mask we wear for survival, demands constant reinforcement. The narcissist uses sympathy as that reinforcement. Every sigh of pity from the empath, every tear shed on their behalf, every sacrifice made in their name, these become bricks in the wall of their false self. Sympathy, then, is not healing. It is construction material for the narcissist's mask. The empath, however, experiences the opposite. Each act of sympathy empties them further. They give without replenishment, sacrifice without reciprocity, love without being loved in return. They mistake exhaustion for devotion, depletion for virtue. And in time, they begin to feel hollow themselves. The tragedy is this: the empath believes they are giving life, but in truth, they are giving only illusion. They are not healing the narcissist's wounds. They are feeding the persona that hides those wounds. They are not lifting the other into wholeness. They are reinforcing the very mask that keeps them fragmented. Sympathy's hollowness reveals itself in the aftermath. When the empath pours themselves out, do they feel peace? No, they feel drained. When the narcissist receives their pity, do they grow? No, they demand more. When the cycle repeats, does it bring transformation? No, it deepens captivity. The hollow gift sustains only the illusion. It allows both to avoid truth. The narcissist avoids their shadow, and the empath avoids their own. Together they circle endlessly around a void, mistaking motion for progress, pity for love, sacrifice for healing. Jung might call this the trap of projection, the empath projecting their own need for redemption onto another, offering sympathy, not as genuine compassion, but as an unconscious attempt to heal themselves through saving. But since the wound cannot be healed externally, the gift is always hollow. The recognition of this hollowness is devastating. The empath must admit that their most cherished offering was never what they believed, that the hours spent comforting, the tears shed in devotion, the sacrifices made in silence, these were not sacred acts of love, but fuel for illusion. They must admit that what they gave was not life, but emptiness. And yet this recognition is necessary, for until they see the hollowness, they cannot begin to offer something real. Until they bury sympathy, they cannot awaken compassion. Until they stop feeding masks, they cannot nurture truth. This is the paradox of sympathy. The more it is given, the less it nourishes. It is a gift that sustains no one. And until the empath recognizes its emptiness, they will remain trapped, believing they are healers, when in fact they are only builders of illusions. The hollow gift must be laid down. Only then can the real gift, the fierce, discerning, life-giving force of compassion, be born. When sympathy dies, grief arrives. It does not come gently. It floods the empath with sorrow so vast, it feels like drowning sorrow, for the years spent giving to a void, for the love poured into illusion, for the self betrayed in the name of devotion. The empath mourns not only the narcissist, but the story they lived. They mourn the dream of salvation, the belief that if they loved enough, endured enough, sacrificed enough, healing would come. They mourn the identity built around pity, the rescuer, the savior, the one who stays when all others leave. They mourn the hope that gave meaning to their suffering, only to discover it was false. This grief is unbearable because it feels like death, not only the death of a relationship, but the death of a self. The empath feels hollow, stripped of the illusions that once sustained them, unsure of who they are without them. Carl Jung wrote that grief is the meeting point between ego and shadow, the collapse of the persona, the confrontation with truth. And though it is agonizing, it is also necessary. For grief burns away illusion. It forces the empath to sit with reality, unsoftened, to feel the raw ache of what was lost, what was wasted, what was never real. At first, the empath resists. They try to numb the pain with distractions, to bargain with hope, to resurrect sympathy from its grave. But the psyche does not allow resurrection of what must remain dead. The hollow gift cannot be revived. The illusions cannot be rebuilt. The only way forward is through grief itself. So the empath surrenders. They allow the tears to fall not only for the narcissist, but for themselves, for the child within who learned that love meant sacrifice, for the adult who carried that wound into every relationship, for the years spent living in reflection instead of reality. This surrender is the turning point, because grief, when fully felt, transforms. It does not leave the soul empty. It clears space. It makes room for truth, for discernment, for something more enduring than pity. The empath begins to sense this even in the midst of despair. They notice moments of strange clarity, brief flashes where the pain feels like purification rather than punishment. They begin to realize, if I can survive this grief, I can survive the truth. And with that realization, the sorrow begins to shift from paralysis to movement, from collapse to awakening. Grief teaches them that their love was real but misdirected, that their devotion was genuine but misplaced, that their gift was sacred but wasted on a mask. It does not erase the past, but it reframes it not as failure, but as initiation. Jung might call this the descent into the underworld of the psyche, where one confronts death in order to discover rebirth. The empath, by grieving, is dying to an old self, the self who lived on sympathy, who mistook captivity for love. And in that death, a new self is being born. The turning point of grief is this: when the empath realizes that their sorrow is not only about what they lost, but about what they are about to gain. That the death of sympathy is not the end of love, but the beginning of real love. That the ashes of illusion are not emptiness, but fertile ground. This is the paradox of grief. It breaks, but it also clears. It wounds, but it also heals. It ends, but it also begins. And from this turning point, the empath steps forward, still aching, still raw, but ready to face the truth that grief has uncovered. When sympathy lived, the narcissist thrived. Every sigh of pity, every act of rescue, every tear shed on their behalf was a curtain that concealed the stage. Behind that curtain, they wore their mask, the fragile persona, constructed from praise, admiration, and reflected longing. But sympathy is dead now, and without it, the curtain falls. For the first time, the empath sees what was always there. Not the radiant soul they once imagined, not the wounded child deserving endless devotion, but a hollow performer, bound by their own mask. The unmasking does not happen in a single dramatic moment. It unfolds gradually, like fog dissolving under morning light. The empath notices how every story of suffering shifts depending on the audience, how every tear appears when accountability threatens, how tenderness vanishes the moment their needs are met. They see the calculation behind the performance. They see the hunger disguised as fragility. They see the coldness beneath the charm. Carl Jung wrote that what we deny in ourselves we project onto others. The narcissist denied their shadow shame, inadequacy, fear of unworthiness, and so they wore the mask of grandiosity, demanding others reflect it back. The empath, blinded by sympathy, once played their part perfectly. But now, with pity buried, the mask no longer convinces. The narcissist senses this shift. They feel the power draining from the performance. Their usual weapon stories of abandonment, pleas for rescue, manufactured despair no longer land with the same force. The empath's eyes, once wide with sympathy, now narrow with discernment, and discernment is deadly to illusion. The unmasking terrifies the narcissist. For without the empath's belief, they are left alone with the very shadow they have spent their life avoiding. They feel the emptiness roaring inside, the shame pressing closer, the void that no reflection can silence. They double down: more stories, more crises, more emotional theater. But the empath no longer feeds it. The sight is both liberating and devastating. Liberating because the empath finally sees truth. They are no longer bound by the illusion of fragility, no longer manipulated by pity, no longer deceived by performance. They can look at the narcissist and say, "This is not my burden to carry. This is not my destiny to fix." Devastating because it reveals how much was lost, how many years were given to a mask, how much love was poured into a void, how much of themselves they betrayed in service to an illusion. Yet even in this devastation, strength begins to stir. For to unmask another is to unmask oneself. The empath now recognizes how their own wounds blinded them, how their hunger to be needed made them susceptible, how their shadow bound them to the narcissists. And in this recognition, the cycle breaks. The narcissist, stripped of sympathy's shield, stands revealed, not a god, not a savior, not a soulmate, but a frightened soul trapped in their own unintegrated shadow. The empath, stripped of illusion, stands revealed too, not a victim, not a martyr, not a rescuer, but a soul awakening to truth, to boundaries, to freedom. This is the unmasking, the death of illusion, the exposure of shadow, the revelation that love built on sympathy was never love at all. And though the truth burns, it also illuminates. For in seeing clearly, the empath has already begun the real work. After the unmasking comes a silence. The empath standing before truth feels raw, emptied, disoriented. The illusions that once guided them are gone. Sympathy has died, the mask has fallen, and in the space left behind, something new begins to form: discernment. Discernment is not immediate. It arrives hesitantly, like a child learning to walk. The empath questions themselves at first. Am I being cruel by refusing to comfort them? Am I selfish for putting down this burden? Am I wrong to no longer believe their stories? But gradually a deeper voice begins to speak. A voice that does not come from pity, nor from fear, but from truth. This is the voice of discernment. Carl Jung wrote that awareness is the first step toward freedom, and awareness sharpens here. The empath begins to notice patterns with clarity, how every crisis coincides with accountability, how every plea for pity follows an act of cruelty, how every display of fragility dissolves the moment their needs are met. They begin to distinguish appearance from reality, words from actions, performance from authenticity, longing from love. This is the birth of discernment, the ability to see not only what is presented, but what is concealed. For the first time, the empath recognizes the difference between pity and compassion. Pity says, I will erase myself for you. Compassion says, I will hold space for you, but I will not betray myself. Pity chains, compassion frees. The empath also begins to recognize the difference between love and manipulation. Manipulation demands endless sacrifice fueled by guilt. Love invites mutual growth rooted in respect. Manipulation drains. Love replenishes. With discernment, the empath no longer feels compelled to rescue. They can watch the narcissist collapse into the victim role and, instead of rushing forward, step back. They can hear the familiar stories of betrayal and respond not with devotion but with clarity. This is not mine to carry. This is not cruelty. It is wisdom. It is love refined by truth. The narcissist senses the shift. The strategies that once held power no longer land. The empath's gaze, once glowing with sympathy, now shines with steadiness. And steadiness is the narcissist's greatest threat, for without pity the mask crumbles. The empath, meanwhile, feels both grief and relief. Grief for the illusions that have died. Relief for the freedom discernment brings. They no longer feel bound by guilt, chained by pity, blinded by longing. They begin to breathe again, not as a savior, but as themselves. Jung might call this the awakening of consciousness, the moment when the unconscious wound ceases to rule in silence and becomes visible, integrated, transformed. Discernment is not only about others, it is also about the self. The empath begins to see their own patterns, their own shadows, their own hunger to be needed. And in seeing, they begin to choose differently. This is the birth of discernment, a new vision sharper than sight, steadier than sympathy, deeper than illusion. It is the beginning of wisdom, the foundation of freedom, the seed of a life no longer built on self-betrayal. The real work begins here, not with rescuing others, but with rescuing themselves. Discernment sharpens the empath's sight, but clarity about the narcissist is only half the work. The deeper task is inward, confronting the shadow that made the empath so vulnerable to illusion in the first place. Carl Jung taught that the shadow is everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves, everything disowned and exiled into the unconscious. The shadow is not evil, it is neglected truth. And for the empath, that truth is devastating. They needed to be needed. This need was not chosen. It was born in childhood, when love felt conditional, given only when they were quiet, compliant, useful. They learned that their worth was measured not in who they were, but in what they gave. So they gave endlessly. They silenced their pain, absorbed others' wounds, erased themselves for belonging. This is the demand of the shadow: be indispensable or be abandoned, save or disappear, sacrifice or be unloved. The narcissist did not create this demand. They exploited it. They knew instinctively that the empath's deepest fear was irrelevance. So they positioned themselves as eternally broken, forever in need. And the empath, desperate to be needed, chained themselves to the role of rescuer. Now, with sympathy dead and discernment alive, the empath sees this truth, and it terrifies them, because it means their suffering was not only caused by the narcissist's cruelty, it was also sustained by their own unconscious need. It means they were not only victims of manipulation, but participants in a bargain they never admitted. If I heal you, you will love me. If I save you, I will matter. If I endure, I will not be abandoned. This realization cuts deeper than betrayal. It feels like self-betrayal. And yet this is the very work Jung described: the confrontation with the shadow, the integration of what was once denied. The empath must face this demand not with judgment, but with compassion. They must hold the inner child who first made that bargain, who believed sacrifice was the price of love. They must say, "You are enough without saving anyone. You are worthy without being indispensable. You are loved simply because you exist." This is not easy. The shadow resists. The need to be needed does not vanish overnight. It whispers in moments of doubt, tempting the empath to return to old roles, to offer pity once more. But now discernment keeps them steady. They can hear the whisper and still choose differently. The shadow's demand, once unconscious, is now visible. And in that visibility, it loses its power. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This is the empath's task now: to make conscious the darkness within, the hunger, the fear, the need, and to embrace it as part of themselves, not as a chain. The shadow, once confronted, becomes not a prison, but a guide. It teaches the empath where they are vulnerable, where they must heal, where they must draw boundaries. It teaches them that true love cannot be built on unconscious bargains, but only on conscious choice. This is the shadow's demand: to be seen, acknowledged, and integrated. And by facing it, the empath steps into a new kind of freedom, one rooted not in denial, but in wholeness. Confronting the shadow reveals the wound, but knowing the wound exists is not the same as healing it. The real work now begins. For the empath, healing is not glamorous. It is not a sudden transformation or a triumphant rebirth. It is slow, deliberate, often painful labor, the steady work of tending to the soul they once abandoned. Carl Jung wrote that healing requires integration, the weaving together of what was once split apart. For the empath, this means calling back the parts of themselves they gave away in the name of love. The first step is returning to the inner child, the one who learned that love was conditional, that safety required silence, that worth depended on service. This child has waited in the shadows for years, unheard, unseen, unloved. And now at last the empath turns inward and says, "I see you. I hear you. I will not abandon you again." This act is not sentimental, it is revolutionary. For every time the empath comforted the narcissist, what they were really longing for was someone to comfort themselves. Every tear they wiped from another's face was a disguised plea for someone to wipe their own. Every sacrifice they made for another's survival was an unconscious attempt to prove their own worth. Now the direction reverses. They begin to comfort their own pain, tend their own wounds, nourish their own soul. They learn to validate themselves. My needs matter. My feelings are real. My boundaries are sacred. The work of healing also means reclaiming their voice. For too long, they silenced themselves to avoid conflict, to maintain peace, to keep the illusion alive. Now they practice speaking truth, not with cruelty, but with clarity. At first their voice trembles, but with each word it grows stronger. Healing demands boundaries. The empath once believed boundaries were selfish, a denial of love. Now they learn the opposite boundaries are love directed both inward and outward. By saying no to what harms them, they say yes to life, to freedom, to authenticity. This labor is not easy. The old patterns still call. There are days when the empath longs for the simplicity of pity, the comfort of old illusions, the familiar rhythm of self-betrayal. But healing is not about perfection. It is about persistence, choosing again and again to return to the self they once abandoned. Jung might say this is the individuation process in action, the gradual alignment of the conscious and unconscious, the integration of shadow and light, the emergence of the self. Each act of self-care, each boundary, each moment of truth is a step toward wholeness. And as the empath heals, something remarkable happens. Their compassion deepens. Not the blind pity that once chained them, but a clearer, wiser compassion, one that honors both self and other, one that sees without illusion, one that gives without erasure. This is the paradox of healing. By turning inward, the empath becomes more capable of loving outward. By comforting themselves, they become better able to comfort others. By reclaiming their own soul, they finally embody the love they once tried to give away. The work of healing is long unglamorous, often invisible, but it is the foundation of freedom. And for the first time, the empath is not working to save another. They are working to save themselves. Healing begins within, but to endure it must be protected without. This is where the empath learns the sacred discipline of boundaries. For too long, they mistook boundaries for cruelty. They believed love meant endless availability, constant sacrifice, perpetual surrender. To say no felt like rejection. To draw a line felt like abandonment. To choose themselves felt like betrayal. But now, through grief, shadow work, and healing, they see the truth. Boundaries are not walls to keep others out. They are doors that decide who may enter. They are not weapons of rejection. They are shields of dignity. They are not acts of selfishness. They are acts of love. Carl Jung taught that the self must emerge as the true center of life, not the persona built for others, not the shadow denied in silence. Boundaries are the structure that allows this emergence. They guard the self, ensuring that the empath does not once again vanish into another's hunger. At first, boundaries feel fragile. The empath practices them with trembling hands, saying no when guilt screams yes, walking away when pity begs them to stay, choosing rest when old habits push them to overgive. The narcissist, sensing the change, resists fiercely. They push harder, test limits, escalate demands. They accuse, "You've changed. You don't care. You're selfish." But for the first time, the empath does not crumble, because they know that every accusation is not truth. It is manipulation, desperate to revive the old cycle. And so they hold the line. With each act of discipline, the empath feels stronger. They discover that boundaries do not shrink. Love, they refine it. They allow relationships to breathe, to balance, to exist in truth. They create space where both self and other can be whole, not enmeshed. Boundaries also reshape compassion. The empath no longer absorbs every wound, no longer feels compelled to fix what is not theirs. They can witness suffering without being consumed, offer kindness without erasing themselves, give without being drained. Their compassion becomes sharper, wiser, sustainable. This discipline extends beyond relationships. It touches every aspect of life. The empath learns to guard their time, their energy, their dreams. They stop overcommitting, stop living in constant apology, stop betraying their own needs. They begin to live in alignment, saying yes only to what nourishes, no to what depletes. At times, the guilt still whispers. The old shadow still murmurs, "If you are not needed, you are nothing." But the empath now knows how to answer. "I am worthy even when I choose myself. I am enough even without sacrifice." Jung might call this the maturation of the self, no longer porous and vulnerable, but strong, centered, sovereign. Boundaries are the discipline that guards this sovereignty. This discipline does not harden the empath, it liberates them. It allows them to love without losing themselves, to give without depletion, to live without chains. It ensures that the work of healing endures, that the freedom won through pain is not surrendered again. The empath has discovered a new truth. Love without boundaries is not love. It is captivity. Compassion without limits is not compassion. It is self-destruction. Boundaries are the discipline that turns healing into wholeness. And through them, the empath prepares for the next transformation, the birth of real compassion, clear, fierce, and liberating. Sympathy is dead. Boundaries now stand firm. And into this space, something new and astonishing is born, real compassion. For the empath, this discovery is transformative. They realize that what they once called compassion was often pity, blind, heavy, and entangling. It was a compassion without clarity, driven by guilt, rooted in the need to be needed. It gave endlessly, but without wisdom. It poured out, but never replenished. It healed no one, and destroyed the one who gave. Now compassion feels different. It is no longer the frantic impulse to rescue, but the steady presence of truth. It no longer says, "I will erase myself for you," but instead, "I will stand with you, but I will not disappear." Carl Jung taught that wholeness emerges when opposites are integrated, shadow and light, self and other, giving and receiving. This integration gives birth to compassion that is both tender and fierce. It feels, but it also discerns. It cares, but it does not enable. It loves, but it does not lose itself. The empath begins to live this compassion in practice. When they witness another's suffering, they do not collapse into pity. They listen, they honor, they care, but they no longer confuse another's pain with their own responsibility. They can say, "I see you, I hear you, I respect your struggle, but I cannot carry it for you." This kind of compassion is powerful because it frees both souls. The empath is no longer enslaved, and the other is no longer shielded from their own work. Compassion respects the dignity of struggle. It allows others to face their shadows rather than rescuing them from growth. The narcissist, confronted with this new compassion, finds it intolerable, for it does not feed the mask. It does not fuel the persona. It does not reinforce the illusion. The empath no longer pities, no longer rescues, no longer erases themselves. Instead, they offer truth. And truth is the one gift the narcissist cannot use. But for the empath, compassion becomes a source of strength. It no longer drains, it sustains. It no longer betrays, it protects. It no longer binds, it liberates. They begin to feel a new sense of peace, a steadiness they have never known. Their heart is still tender, but it is no longer porous. Their love is still vast, but it is no longer endless sacrifice. Their care is still deep, but it is no longer captivity. This is the power of real compassion. It allows the empath to engage fully with life without being consumed by it. It allows them to witness suffering without drowning, to offer love without erasure, to live connected without losing their center. Jung might call this the awakening of the self as a vessel of integration. Compassion purified by grief and boundaries is no longer a shadowed impulse. It is the conscious expression of wholeness. The empath now understands. Compassion is not the act of saving another. It is the courage to love truthfully, to stand present without illusion, to honor both self and other as whole beings. This is the liberation sympathy never offered. This is the strength pity never held. This is the love that heals without chains. At last, the empath stands where they never imagined they could, whole, sovereign, free. The path here has been long and brutal. Sympathy had to die. Illusions had to shatter. The shadow had to be faced. The grief endured, the old self surrendered. But in this surrender, something extraordinary has been born, the individuated self. Carl Jung described individuation as the process of becoming whole, the unification of all aspects of the psyche, shadow and light persona, and truth past and present. It is not perfection, but integration. Not innocence, but wisdom. Not illusion, but reality embraced in its entirety. For the empath, this self feels like home. They no longer define themselves by wounds. They are not the abandoned child, though they honor that child's story. They are not the rescuer, though they still carry deep compassion. They are not the victim of the narcissist, though they acknowledge the scars left behind. They are more. They are whole. The individuated empath lives from knowing, not seeing. They no longer project their hunger for love onto others, no longer confuse pity for devotion, no longer seek worth in being needed. Their love is rooted within. Their compassion is fierce and discerning. Their boundaries are clear and strong. Their presence is authentic, unshaken by masks or illusions. And this presence transforms how they move through the world. In relationships, they no longer tolerate manipulation. They choose partners who honor reciprocity, who give as well as receive, who meet truth with truth. They are not afraid to walk away because they no longer fear abandonment. They have abandoned themselves for the last time. In community, they no longer feel responsible for saving everyone. They give where they can, but with wisdom and balance. Their energy is no longer swallowed by endless crises, but directed toward growth, creation, and connection. Within themselves, they no longer fight the shadow. They embrace it. The wounds that once ruled them now guide them. The pain that once enslaved them now teaches them. The child who once begged for love now rests in the arms of the adult who has finally learned to give it. This is not the empath reborn as someone else. It is the empath finally living as who they were always meant to be. The narcissist's mask may still haunt their memory, but it no longer binds them. They understand now they were never called to rescue another from their shadow. They were called to confront their own. And in doing so, they have become free. This is the individuated self, a soul no longer fractured by illusion, no longer enslaved by pity, no longer defined by wounds. A soul that lives in integration, compassionate yet discerning, tender yet strong, loving yet boundaried. A soul that has walked through fire and emerged whole. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For the empath, that privilege has been earned in pain, but realized in freedom. They are no longer merely an empath. They are an individuated being. And in that wholeness, they embody the deepest truth of all. Love begins within, healing begins within, freedom begins within.